Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. General Arnold and I were together that day on September the 11th. What I will walk you through here is a chronology of the attacks, and I've presented it in a matrix form. And the only thing I lay claim to is having studied all of the attacks and how they were interwoven together. This was not a linear sequence of events where one attack began and ended, and then a second attack began and ended. This was a coordinated, well-planned attack. We had multiple airplanes in the air. The fog and friction of war was evident everywhere in the country, both on the civil side as well as the military side. And this hopefully will show you how those interwoven events came about. And I will tell you that the times on this chart come from our logs. The time on the chart is the time that's in the log. It may not be the exact time the event happened. It may be the time when the log keeper was advised or became aware of the event. The first thing that happened in the morning related to, thank you, Don, related to the events at 8:02 a.m. Eastern Standard Time is when American Airlines 11 took off out of Boston. American Airlines 11 was a 767, and it was headed, I believe, to Los Angeles. 14 minutes later, also coming out of Boston Logan, United Airlines 175, 757, also headed to Los Angeles, took off out of Boston, and initially took roughly the same ground track as American 11. 3 minutes later, American Airlines 77 took off out of Dulles here in Washington, also headed to Los Angeles, and also a 757, and proceeded westbound toward the West Coast. So now the first three airplanes are airborne together. The first time that anything untoward, and this was gleaned from FAA response, that anything out of the ordinary happened was at 8:20, when the electronic transponder in American Airlines 11 blinked off, if you will, just disappeared from the screen. Obviously, the terrorists turned that transponder off, and that airplane, although it did not disappear from the radar scope, it became a much, much more difficult target to discern for the controllers, who now only could look at the primary radar return off the airplane. That was at 8:20. At 8:40 in our logs is the first occasion where the FAA is reporting a possible hijacking of American Airlines Flight 11. And the initial response to us at that time was a possible hijacking. It had not been confirmed. At that same moment, the F-15 alert aircraft at Otis Air Force Base, Massachusetts, about 153 miles away, were placed immediately on battle stations by the Northeast Air Defense Sector commander. At 8:43, as this is going on, the fourth airplane, United 93, takes off out of Newark, New Jersey. It's a 757. It is headed for San Francisco. At 8:46, our next log event, we get the last, and by the way, much of this radar data for these primary targets was not seen that day. It was reconstructed days later by the 84th Radar Evaluation Squadron and other agencies like it, who are professionals at going back and looking at radar tapes, and then given that they're loaded with knowledge after the fact, they can go and find things that perhaps were not visible during the event itself. At 8:46, the last data near the Trade Center. 8:46, the first impact on the Trade Center. At that minute is when the Otis F-15s were scrambled, and again, they were 153 miles away. And that scramble came, and General Arnold, I'm sure, can address this, based on a conversation between the Northeast Sector commander and himself. Those F-15s were airborne in 6 minutes. That is well inside the time that is allowed for them to get airborne, but because they were on battle stations, the pilots were in the cockpits ready to start engines, that scramble time was shortened by a significant amount of time. At 8:53, that's a minute later, in the radar reconstruction, we're now picking up the primary radar contacts off of the F-15s out of Otis. At 8:57, which is 7 minutes after the first impact, is, according to our logs, when the FAA reports the first impact. And about this time is when CNN coverage to the general public is beginning to appear on the TV, not of the impact, but of the burning tower shortly thereafter. So you can see what in the military, I'm sure you've heard us talk to the fog and friction of war, and as the intensity increases, the lag tends to also increase for how quickly information gets passed. 9:02, United 175, the second airplane, which, by the way, never turned off its transponder before impact, crashes into the North Tower at 9:02. The distance of those fighters, which had been scrambled out of Otis, at that particular point, they were still 71 miles away, about 8 minutes out, and going very fast. At 9:05, FAA reports a possible hijack of United 175. Again, that's 3 minutes after the impact in the tower, is how long it is taking now the information to flow through the system to the command and control agencies, and through the command and control agencies to the pilots in the cockpit. At 9:09, Langley F-16s are directed to battle stations, just based on the general situation and the breaking news and the general, the developing feeling about what's going on. And about that same time, way out in the west, is when America 77, which in the meantime has turned off its transponder and turned left back toward Washington, appears back in radar coverage. And my understanding is the FAA controllers now are beginning to pick up primary skin paints on an airplane, and they don't know exactly whether that is 77, and they're asking a lot of people whether it is, including a C-130 that's westbound toward Ohio. At 9:11, FAA reports a crash into the South Tower. You can see now that lag time has increased from 7 minutes from impact to report. Now it's 9 minutes from impact to report. You can only imagine what's going on the floors of the control centers around the country. At 9:11, I just mentioned that. 9:16, now FAA reports a possible hijack of United Flight 93, which is out in the Ohio area. But that's the last flight that is going to impact the ground. At 9:24, the FAA reports a possible hijack of 77. That's sometime after they had been tracking this primary target. And at that moment as well is when the Langley F-16s were scrambled out of Langley. At 9:25, America 77 is reported heading toward Washington, D.C., not exactly precise information, just general information across the chat logs. 9:27, Boston FAA reports a fifth aircraft missing, Delta Flight 89, and many people have never heard of Delta Flight 89. We call that the first red herring of the day because there were a number of reported possible hijackings that unfolded over the hours immediately following the actual attacks. Delta 89 was not hijacked, enters the system, increases the fog and friction, if you will, as we begin to look for that. But he lands about 7 or 8 minutes later and clears out of the system. At 9:30, the Langley F-16s are airborne. They're 105 miles away from the Washington area. 9:34, through chat, FAA is unable to precisely locate American Airlines Flight 77. 9:35, F-16s are reported airborne, and many times reported airborne is not exactly when they took off, it's just when the report came down that they were airborne. At 9:37, we have the last radar data near the Pentagon, and 9:40, immediately following that, is when 93 up north turns its transponder off out in the west toward Ohio and begins a left turn back toward the east. At 9:49, FAA reports that Delta 89, which had been reported as missing, is now reported as a possible hijacking. So again, He is, I'm sorry, 941. Again, he is in the system. He's kind of a red herring for us. Now, the only thing that I would point out on this chart is this says 943 American Airlines 77 impacts the Pentagon. The timeline on the impact on the Pentagon was changed to 937. 943 is the time that was reported that day. It was the time we used, and it took about 2 weeks to discover in the parking lot of the Pentagon this entry camera for the parking lot, which happened to be oriented toward the Pentagon at the time of impact. And the recorded time is 937. And that's why the timeline went from 943 to 937, because it is the best documented evidence for the impact time that we have. Getting toward the end now, 947 is when Delta 89 clears the system by landing in Cleveland, so he is not a hijack. Lots of things are going on now in the system as the sectors begin to call both units that are part of 1st Air Force and NORAD, as well as units that have nothing to do with us. We're beginning to call everyone now. And the 103rd Air Control Squadron, for instance, stationed in Connecticut, is an air control squadron, a radar squadron, and they got their radar online, operational, and began to link their radar picture into the Northeast system. They are not normally part of NORAD. This is really the initial part of a huge push the rest of that day to link as many radars in on the interior as we can and to get as many fighters on alert as we can. At 10:02, United 93, last radar data, and the estimated impact time for United 93 is 10:03. At 10:07, FAA reports there may be a bomb on board 93. That's 4 minutes after the impact. At 10:15, they report that it's crashed, and you can see now that fog and friction lag time has increased from 7 minutes to 9 minutes to 15 minutes because of the level of activities that are going on. And there are notations here about other airplanes as we begin to divert other airplanes that are just out, were intended for training that day. We're picking up the phone, calling Syracuse, the Air National Guard. They're beginning to get flights airborne. They're beginning to arm those aircraft with whatever weapons they have handy so we can posture that defense. That is how the timeline unfolded. As you can see, it is a fabric of interwoven actions. This was not just a linear event. So lots of things going on, lots of activities, and lots of C2 centers. Sir, that completes my piece.